And so we'll let everybody get settled for a minute. I'm glad to see some of the folks that are coming in last. I was looking around. Well, some of our more people that comment more weren't here yet, and I was like, well, I want to do a lot more talking. But now I feel better. So now, not to say that Stephen talks a lot. And I'm just kidding. No, just kidding. No, I appreciate everybody being here, and like I said, we'll get everybody get settled, and we'll go to God in a word of prayer, and then we'll get started here with the lesson. So let's go ahead and say a prayer. Well, pray with me. Our most holy and righteous Heavenly Father, we're indeed thankful for all that we have, thankful for all the many blessings. Be with us, Lord, as we study your word this hour in this class and in others. Be with the teachers and be with the students and help us to apply the things that we study. Help us to grow closer to one another and closer to Thee as we take this walk in life. And pray, Father, that You be with all those that couldn't be here today for whatever reasons and help us to see about their needs and care for them as only You can. Thankful for Your Son and the salvation that He brought through the cross, and help us never take that for granted. Be with us as we go through this study, and this is our prayer in Christ's name. Amen. All right. Well, again, thanks everybody for being here. Thankful for those that are watching online. I know there's quite a few folks doing that, so appreciate that as well. So before we get started in the actual lesson this morning, let's go ahead and say our memory verse for this month. It's 2 Samuel 7:16. And Your house and Your kingdom shall be established forever before You. Your throne shall be established forever. And again, I think what we're talking about in the book of James, again, this true and practical religion of the book, we're going to pick up here in James chapter 2. If you've been in the class, we finished about verse 8 last week. We're going to go through 8 through 13. And then we're going to spend the rest of the time just finishing up chapter 2. There's a lot there, so hopefully we'll get through it and can kind of stay on track there as far as that. Like I mentioned right before class started, everybody makes a lot of great comments, so it's kind of like a real balancing act to try to how much to say and how to keep it going. But I appreciate all the comments every week, and also the comments before and after class. So it's very encouraging. So thank you for that. Like I said, we're going to pick up in James chapter 2, verse 8. We're going to read 8 through 13. We'll make some comments about that, and then we'll jump into that next section. Beginning in verse 8, it says there, if you really fulfill the royal law according to the Scripture, you shall love your neighbor as yourself, you do well. But if you show partiality, you commit sin and are convicted by the law as a transgressor. For whoever shall keep the whole law and yet stumble in one point, he is guilty of all. For he who said, do not commit adultery, also said, do not murder. Now, if you do not commit adultery, but you do murder, you have become a transgressor of the law. So speak and so do as those who will be judged by the law of liberty. For judgment is without mercy to the one who has shown no mercy. Mercy triumphs over judgment. And again, we had just talked last week about the partiality and where were they? What was the whole idea? What was the partiality coming from, or the favoritism coming from? Yeah, so yeah, definitely. As those that were coming into, as Benjamin said, and as JD said, those that were coming in and how they were treated, as far as somebody dressed really, we'd say to the nines. I don't know if we use that expression anymore. I probably just dated myself, but anyways, but it just, what is and I should have asked some teenager before class started. What's the way? It's like. Anyways, so somebody that's just dressed very elaborately, and again, we said there at first it wasn't about necessarily on the rich person to start with, was it? It was more on how the member or that person was treating that rich person, right? So it's not necessarily the rich person did anything wrong, and necessarily, but again, it was how they did. But now it does talk about there in verse 6 was about the rich should not oppress. But the whole point there is what under Christ, what as Christians we are all equal, right? I mean, that's a great equalizer, right? So, as far as that, and that's what the thing is. So and we talked about all the different ways people can show favoritism, whether it's by family, whether it's by wealth, or if it's by color of your skin, if it's by whatever the case might be, where your history is, or your family history, or by your, whatever it might be. There's tons of ways we show that. But then he talks about this here, and so what does he say then about, and he really kind of steps it up a notch here in verse 9. What does he say about when you show this partiality, or you show this favoritism? What are you doing? Yeah. Fulfilling the royal law. And if you don't, I'm sorry, got a little behind there. But it's sin. And I think that it's interesting, that word there that he says in verse 9, he says, you're as a transgressor. That's not a word we use a lot. What is that word, when you hear that word? Again, it's sin. What does that word mean to you? Or what do you think about when you hear that word? What's that? You've broken the law? And actually, and it's interesting, one of the definitions I found, it's actually, one of the ways it was defined is the idea of stepping over God's line. And I like that. It made a lot of sense. Is that a transgressor is one that steps over God's line. If you've ever, been somewhere and it's, you got no trespassing signs, or you got something, going on, where, there's certain areas you're not supposed to go to or whatever, not a certain place you're not supposed to go. And that's kind of the idea there, I think, is that you don't cross that line. We all had that, right, as kids, right? Amy tells a story. She's very proud of this, that when our daughter was little, who's 31 now, but when she was little, we had a big wide driveway, and she had plenty of room to play, but she had a spot, how the lines in concrete will be kind of divided every so often. Well, there was a line that Amanda knew that she wasn't supposed to cross that line, and she wasn't supposed to get any closer to the street than that line. Well, as somebody will do sometimes, and she got a stubborn streak in her, she decided to go cross that line, and she reaped the consequences of crossing that line. And that was Amy's line in that sense, right? So she crossed that line. And why? She was corrected because why? She would put herself in danger, right? And that's the same way with this, right? The lines that God puts there for us, the things that God puts in place for us are just that, right? They're to keep us safe, right? So we shouldn't, you hear that story about somebody wanting to, just how close they want to get to that line, right? Or, they're dancing on the edge of that line or whatever the case might be. And that's not the point. The idea there is not to be a transgressor. But he says here, that, again, if we show partiality, we commit sin, and, a sin, a law of the transgressor, or transgress the law. It says, for whoever... In verse 10, it says, so whoever shall keep the whole law, and yet stumble in one point, he is guilty of all. For he has said in verse 11, do not commit adultery, and also said, do not murder. Now, if you do not commit adultery, but you do murder, you have become a transgressor of the law. Again, that idea of you cross the line. And I just wanted to, and again, we talked about this before, the showing the partiality kind of got a little bit ahead. And then stumbling is when we show that partiality. But I thought when we talk about this, because that line, when he says that about whether you're adulterous or you're a murderer or whatever the sin might be, and this came to my mind, I don't know if it helps or hurts the conversation here, but what sin troubles you more? Is there a sin that bothers you more than another? Or maybe there's a sin that's more tempting to you than another, right? And I think we're all, and I think I'm not asking for a verbal response there, but I think just thinking about that is that we talk about this and we transgress the law, or we we violate God's law, but there are some sins that are, say, more personal, right? I know Benjamin talked last week about in his lesson about alcohol, right? And that's a very personal thing to him. It's a very personal thing to me. If you've ever had a family member that's had that issue, right, whether it's drugs or alcohol, it's a very personal thing. And so to see someone try to, when somebody comes up and tries to make the arguments for social drinking or whatever the case might be, it gets your blood pumping, doesn't it? I mean, Benjamin's nodding. I mean, it just does. And I think we've all probably got, if you've been a victim of a certain sin, whether it's maybe you're, had divorce in your family or something like that, there's certain things, again, but they're all what? At the end of the day, they're all sin, right? And whether we take them more personally or not, well, how does God look at it? What's that? Looks at it all the same. Why? Yeah. It's going to cost you your soul, right? I mean, that's the idea there, right? And again, some are, harder to come back from. And what I put up there, we don't, for sake of time this morning, but those are some of those, passages. Romans 1, 28 through 32, Galatians 5, 19 through 21, Revelations 21, 8. those are ones, obviously, you know, that just kind of list multiple sins. And in those, and it's often pointed out, you have, some what we would consider like murder or adultery is mentioned in there, but also what? Disobedient to parents is mentioned in there. Lying is mentioned in there in some of those lists. So again, it's that idea that there's multiples. Yes, sir?
I'm sorry, I don't mean to interrupt you.
No, go ahead.
I was going to ask a question. Sorry, I don't attend here, so I hope this doesn't throw the class off.
No, that's okay.
But just partiality in general, like when I think about that, I guess in my head, I'm like, in some sense, I always show partiality. I guess not to be like, I don't do that all the time, but like, I mean, if someone's my age,
Mm-hmm.
grew up with them,
Yep.
we don't have kids, and so we spend a lot of time together. Like in some sense, I guess I show partiality because we just have a lot of things in common. So I guess how far do you take that? I guess was my question is, obviously we need to, our commonality is Christ, not what we look like, which you already said.
Yeah.
So I was just curious on kind of obviously everyone's line is going to be different.
Oh, yeah, definitely.
I don't know.
No, I get it. And we actually talked about that a little bit in previous classes, just the fact that you're always going to have those folks that you're closer to, right? Whether, like you mentioned, where you're at in your life, whether, when you're in college and you're single, whether you're first married and no children and you have children. At that section in life, I think we're all going to have people we're closer to. I think the idea there is that you don't elevate that person or that group to where you're treating them differently or you look at them differently when it comes to the truth. And I think that's where I think it comes to. And in fact, I think we can use those groups that we're closest to. A lot of times, say if you have a brother or sister that's your same age and they have an issue, a lot of times it means a lot more coming from you or somebody you're close to than it would from me, a total stranger or an elder or a deacon, or you know what I'm saying? And I think we can use that closeness in that regard. If that helps, I mean, I think that, but I do think I think what he's talking about here, and we've talked about that, is that when you're taking that you're showing that partiality, that I treat you differently, and that I'm letting it affect my relationship. That help a little bit? Okay. That's a great question. And it kind of brings us all back around. But again, for sake of time, I'm not going to go through those lists. But again, just that idea of where we're at in this. And again, when we talk about that, and I like that what he says there in verse 12, so speak and so do as those who will be judged by the law of liberty. For judgment is without mercy to the one who has shown no mercy. Mercy triumphs over judgment. And again, we've been talking about this since the beginning of the book, right? Is what is James all about? It's not just about an intellectual belief, right? And we're going to really get into that here in just a few minutes. But the idea is what we do with that belief. Yeah, hearers and doers. You get after it, right? That we have a responsibility as Christians. If we're going to be that, we have to be what we say we are, right? And so just to say it and give it lip service is not much to it. We have to show action. And I think that's exactly what he's saying there. And then he talks about, in the last verse here, he's talking about the idea of judgment in verse 13. For judgment is without mercy to the one who has shown no mercy. Mercy triumphs over judgment. And again, I think there we're talking about that, and we must be, and again, just as God is going to show us mercy and has shown us mercy, then we must show mercy toward others, right? And that we have to have that, and we have to have that as part of our life. So is there any other thoughts or comments on that one? Yes, Stephen, go ahead.
You may have already covered this in a previous class, but the whole idea of partiality really interferes with spreading the gospel. Building that have never been here before, and they don't feel as though they're dressed like everybody or they don't fit in. We have to be cognizant of the fact that they're here seeking something, and we're sinners, forgiven sinners, and we need to really make sure that we're not getting in the way of the gospel. Partiality is a huge enemy to share the gospel.
Yeah.
We look at somewhat of a negative perspective, here. I've heard stories from people personally, and my brother, when he's taught people the gospel, told them they've driven up to the church building multiple times, and they just wouldn't go in.
Yeah.
I don't think I'm going to fit in there. They're not going to accept me. Yeah. They're not going to receive me. because I'm not like them. But I want to be. I just don't know how.
Yeah.
So that's something to think about with regard to partiality. I think that's part of why it's sinful.
Yeah, that's a great point. I think I've heard people talk about, they almost think they have to get to a level of perfection before they obey the gospel. In other words, I've got to have all this stuff figured out and all this stuff solved, and I'm just not there yet. It's that idea, the old analogy of we're a hospital, not a country club. And I think a lot of people, that kind of idea, that mindset. Benjamin.
The other thing too with partiality, evidently this was a challenge for early Christians. You have James talking about it. You had issues with the church in Corinth. You had Peter and Barnabas and other men who were taken away. That as well. So it's a bigger issue than we may sometimes think. It seems small to some degree about favoritism and bias, but when he says you're committing sin, that really changes it.
Yeah, he does. It drives the point home. And I think I think sometimes we get caught up too in thinking that this is a 21st century thing, right? This is something that just happens now, or we think about in our current context, but it's been going on forever, right? It's just, as far as people treating others. Hugh?
Another thing about the fact that we should be giving mercy to others is because unlike God's judgment, which is perfect, ours is imperfect.
That's a great point.
And so if we start judging, there is a chance that we could be judging erroneously. And we certainly don't want to be judged unfairly. And we know the Lord will not. And so we've got to be leaning on this merciful side rather than the judgmental side.
You mentioned at the beginning of the quarter how similar this is to the Sermon on the Mount. So he talks about mercy in verse 13. That's what Jesus says, blessed are the merciful, for they shall receive mercy.
Yeah, that's a great point. And again, you see this throughout. We talked about that at the very beginning. I probably should have bring that back up more often. But the Sermon on the Mount, and especially the Gospel of Matthew, you just see, if you read it and you read it compared to this James's account or James's letter here, it's just, there's so much overlap there. So, any other thoughts or comments there? All right, let's move on to this last section, 14 through 19, or 14 through 26. Actually, the last part of the book. Faith without works cannot save one. As far as looking at our outline. And I'm just going to go ahead. I'm going to read I'm going to read 14 through 17 first, and then we'll kind of break it up into sections there. It says, verse 14 says, "What does it profit, my brethren, if someone says he has faith but does not have works? Can faith save him? If a brother or sister is naked and destitute of daily food, and one of you says to them, depart in peace, be warmed and filled, but you do not give them the things which are needed for the body, what does it profit? Thus also faith by itself, if it does not have works, is dead." And one thing I want to point out, you'll see it as we go through these slides, there's 5 statements about faith, and you probably got those underlined, or you may have them already from other study, but there's 5 statements about faith, directly about faith, and they all hit the same note, right? And what it says there in verse 17, and that verse 17 is actually the first one. It says, we talked first about, demonstration of our faith. He talked about this in 127. We talked about the pure and undefiled religion is this, to visit the widows and the orphans and keep yourself pure. But here he uses the example of having a brother or sister that is naked and destitute of daily food. But again, we have to show our faith, right? We have to demonstrate our faith. And this, like I said, is the first of the 5 statements about faith is found in verse 17, and that is faith that does not have works is dead. And again, so when we talk about this, and it's just going to see this idea repeated of this. And I wanted to mention as we got into this section of the book, we talked about verse 122, and that's one of the key verses of the book, and being a doer of the word and not a hearer only. I also mentioned chapter 4, verse 17, and then who knows to do good and does not do it, to him it is sin. But if you wanted to have a section that's kind of the cornerstone of this book. A lot of people will call this 14 through 26, this section that, right? Because everything he's talking about, everything he's talked about before, and everything he's going to talk about after really centers around this idea of faith and works, right? And how important they are together, and how you can't have one without the other. So, but then again, we have this first statement there of faith that does not have works is dead. And again, it leads to the idea, and again, we've talked about this before, and when he talks about something being dead, that word's pretty self-explanatory, right? But the idea of the word there, the definition of the word is actually barren, unfruitful, ineffective, just vain. Basically, it means it's hollow. There's nothing to it, right? And so when we think about this, so what good does it do if somebody if you did just, it's almost sarcasm, isn't it? Really, what he says there, if you tell that person to just be warmed and filled, if you just tell that, right, you're really not doing anything, are you? I mean, that's the ultimate in lip service, isn't it? I mean, that's just, the idea there. You're not doing anything to it at all, right? So then the next two verses there, in verses 18 and 19, he goes on. Let me back up here. So about us showing our faith. And so we understand that, without works, just to have an intellectual belief, right, or an intellectual thought that's really as far as it goes, or as far as it can go. But it says there in verse 18 and 19, it says, "But if someone will say, 'You have faith and I have works, show me your faith without your works, and I will show you my faith by my works. You believe that there is one God, you do well. Even the demons believe and tremble.'" Now again, that may seem a little shocking at first when we think about that, but it's interesting to note that James uses three examples of faith in this. And who are the three? Well, the three groups or three. So far he's used the first one he's going to call out is the demons and talking about their belief. Then he's going to talk about who? Abraham, and then finally Rahab, right? And all three of their faiths, or where they're those. So the demons and that, we really wouldn't call the demons faith because of they have a belief there, but it doesn't have any action to it. But I want to get back to that in just a second. But I just think it's interesting that if we were talking about, I'm kind of getting ahead of my slides here a little bit, but if we were talking about having faith, who would we think about? What's that? Abraham, right? And we're going to get to that in a moment. But, you think about Hebrews 11. But let's go back here, and I don't want to get too far ahead of myself there. But when we talk about this, what do you think when he says that about, you believe that there is one God, and that, that honestly, that monotheistic belief, right, which was kind of unique to the Jews. But when he says that about the demons, what do you think about that? It says, even the demons believe and tremble. What does that say about the belief is not enough, right? But what does it say about that intellectually, or say if you wanted to say that intellectually, the demons, they understand there is one God, right? And what's their reaction to it?
They reject it.
Fear, they reject it, right? But they have belief, right? And I don't know if this verse, I don't know if I don't know, one of you kind of not toss and turn with it, but yes, sir.
You not believe like the demons and you're afraid. That means there's something you're lacking. That means you're not saved. That means they're not on the side of God, but they're on the opposite side. They believe there is a God. They see all what He's doing. They see His creation. They see everything, but they are not responding to God. But they believe there is a God.
Yeah. They're not taking action, right? And that belief. So they may intellectually believe it. It even shows like a certain level of emotion, right? With this, that they're trembling. Yes, sir.
I find the idea so many times when you get the argument where I only need to believe, I only need to do this without any types of work. It is taking God out of the context that you need to have a relationship with Him. And oftentimes, if you bring that back and be like, okay, all right, if I say you and I are friends, and I never talk to you, I never do anything for you, I never even acknowledge your presence, but I say, oh, yeah, we're friends. No one in their right mind would ever say, yeah, we're friends. Therefore, I don't have a relationship with you because I never put any effort into it. I can kind of understand a worldly mentality of I can't see God directly, so therefore I don't think about him in terms of I need to have a relationship with him. But I think it's important if you ever have this type of argument that you need to bring it back in to say God is someone who we need to have a relationship with. And every single relationship in this world takes work. Everyone will admit to that. Always takes work. To the easiest ones with people that are your own age, to the hardest ones where you're talking to someone who has seen and is a completely different type of mentality than you are. Everything takes work, which is why you got to bring it back like that. This is my thoughts.
Yeah, that's a good point. I'll come back to it and say,
I'm a Christian. I believe in God. I responded to the gospel. But there are times in my life when I still believe in God, but I kind of have a little, I fear a bit because if I commit that sin, whatever sin, and I have not repented quickly, I'm just thinking, if God just come now, what happens? So it shows me still like, I'm already a Christian, but then sometimes if I don't repent, I still have that fear. I believe God. So it's almost like thinking of,
I had in my notes there, and kind of that, I know it's been brought up before. I think Benjamin's brought it up in a couple of his lessons. But remember back to the gospel meeting we had with Brother Rader? What was his whole point, right?
I believe God.
Believe God, not just believing in God, but you believe God, right? And I think that's where, kind of talking about that a little bit, is believe God in that regard. But to your point, yeah, you go ahead.
In John 12:42, the Pharisees believed God, but they refused to follow him because of fear of being put out of the temple.
Yep, that's a great point.
They believe,
Yep.
like demons believe, but not acting on it.
Not acting on it. And I think, and I was going to use the, now you kind of talked about the friendship and being friends or not friends. I think about probably the strongest relationship we would have, or anybody here that's married, hopefully, would have on this earth, right, is your husband-wife relationship, right? And you love your wife, or your wife loves you, hopefully. And, but, how are you sure about that, right? It's by the actions that you take, right? If Amy had never shown any, had never done anything for me, or I'd never done anything for her, then, how would I demonstrate? Exactly. It's got to be demonstrated. And you're right. I mean, it's every relationship we have, right? I mean, as far as that. And this one, and again, I don't know if this will help or hurt the idea of this belief and not taking action on it, but one story I heard, and this kind of stuff just sticks in my mind and helps me kind of put the verse into perspective. But when it talks about that, about this idea, and the story I heard related to verse 19 was the idea of this tightrope walker that was going across Niagara Falls. And the idea was that he had gotten, he'd strung the wire as they do, and he strung it across Niagara Falls. And he did this for several times. He'd gone across, and he'd gotten really good at it, so much so that he could do tricks and take a chair out there and sit on the chair. And this went on for several months, and they were building bigger and bigger crowds coming to see him. Well, he'd gotten so good at it that he put a wheelbarrow, and he pushed a wheelbarrow across this tightrope and brought it back across. And by this time, the crowd is going crazy. They're like, man, that is amazing that he can take that wheelbarrow, push it across, and bring it back. When he gets back over there and he comes back with the wheelbarrow, he looks at the crowd and he goes, do y'all believe I could put someone in that wheelbarrow and wheel them across and bring them back? And the crowd just scream and go, yeah, we know you could. We know you could. Well, can I get a volunteer to go first? Well, the crowd got silent, obviously, right? That's belief only. Like I said, and again, I'm not questioning anybody going to get on a wild wheelbarrow. That's just common sense. So I know that breaks down a little bit, but you get the point, right? I mean, you get the point. And that's exactly what we're talking about, is taking action. And being willing to take that action, right? And put your belief in. And I think that's where he talks about. So you got that intellectual belief in God. You got that emotion that's involved in that belief in God. But then that emotion has to take action. And really that's what, James has been talking about through the book, right? And that, so again, if that helps or hurts, but I just, and it'll probably stick with you now. You'll be thinking about a tightrope guy in a wheelbarrow. That's all you got out of class this morning. So, but again, and that was the question that we kind of already talked to. It's just how strong is our belief, right? You know, not that we're willing to get in that wheelbarrow, but again, y'all get the idea, right? Yeah, anyway.
And this section always makes me think of Luke 10 with the parable of the Good Samaritan. Earlier, when James says, you tell your brother or sister, be warm and filled, you don't, you just lip service. I mean, everybody would, in that day would have thought a priest and a Levite were very faithful people, but they just right past that man. Right. And so it's, it's the same idea. It takes more than just, I believe in God, I'm righteous. It's demonstrated by what you do.
Yeah.
And that Samaritan was the one who was faithful and showed love. Because earlier, the man asked Jesus, well, how do you get salvation? How do you get eternal life? And he says, what does the law say? He said, well, love the Lord with all your heart, your soul, your mind. And all that takes work, takes effort.
Yeah, and just like James is talking about that being the royal law, that law of liberty, that idea, that's where the cornerstone of the Old Testament, right? And that's really what somebody mentioned the Pharisees earlier, and they really didn't get it, right? Because they were all about the pomp and the circumstance and, what to show, right?
I think there in that verse, we see such a great contrast here. And as I sit here and read this and think about what he's saying, thou believest that there is one God, thou doest well. The devils also believe and tremble. We know what the Lord said about evil spirits all the time. He didn't permit them to speak. They knew who Jesus was. Right, but why did they tremble? They trembled, they feared his judgment. Right, that's why they were trembling.
Yeah.
And so basically, he's contrasting here.
Yeah.
You believe, but so do the demons, and they tremble. But do you want to know? Right, the next verse. So we see that great. He's contrasting us against a level of the demons, if you will, in my opinion. Right, so it should cause us to
Yeah.
to think here.
Yeah. Yeah.
And to Kevin's point, in Hebrews chapter 2, the last few verses of that chapter, it talks about Jesus is not here to give aid to anyone but the seed of Abraham. So demons have no hope.
Yeah.
They're trembling. They have no hope.
Yeah.
But they know exactly judgment's coming, and they know who God is.
That's a great point. That's a great point. And again, we have to take that, understand that, and take action on our faith, on our belief. All right, great points. All right, and then let's going on through verses 20 through 26. We'll read this entirely, and we're going to see those next four statements about faith in this section. So verses 20 through 26, it says, But do you want to know, O foolish man, that faith without works is dead? But do you want to know, O foolish man, that faith without works is dead? Was not Abraham our father justified by works when he offered Isaac his son on the altar? Do you see the faith was working together with his works, and by works faith was made perfect? And the scripture was fulfilled, which says, Abraham believed God, and it was accounted to him for righteousness, and he was called the friend of God. You see that a man is justified by works, and not by faith only. Likewise was not Rahab the harlot also justified by works, when she received the messengers and sent them out another way? For as the body without the spirit is dead, so faith without works is dead also. So there's a lot there, and we'll try to unpack a little bit of this as we finish up as we get through the rest of this morning. So we see in the second statement again, very similar to the first one in verse 17, but in verse 20 he says again, But do you not know, O foolish? Do you want to know, O foolish man, that faith without works is dead? Again, and then he's going to go in, and I mentioned this. Again, I think some folks said, and I kind of jumped ahead here a little bit, but just looking at, what we call the heroes of faith in Hebrews chapter 11, if we just look over there, and if you look at, all the people that are mentioned in there, and again, for sake of time, we don't really have it to go over there, but he does talk about that, the start of that chapter where it talks about, now faith is the substance of things hoped for the evidence of the things not seen. For by it the elders obtained a good testimony. By faith we understand that the worlds were framed by the word of God, so that the things which are seen were not made of things which are visible. And then, just in the middle part of that chapter, or not quite in the middle, but if you jumped over to verse 13, where it says, "These all died in faith, not having received the promise, but having seen them afar off, were assured of them, embraced them, and confessed that they were strangers and pilgrims on this earth. For those who say such things declare plainly that they seek a homeland. And truly, if they had called to mind the country from which they had come out, they would have had opportunity to return. But now they desired a better, that is, a heavenly country. Therefore, God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he has prepared a city for them." So again, that's where, whether we talk about Abraham, right, as that, or anybody else that we want to talk about, and we'll talk about Rahab in just a few minutes. But who, if you had to pick someone, who in the Bible that, besides Abraham and Rahab here, who else comes to mind as far as this strength to do what God told them to do? There's a lot of choices there, so. Paul? Daniel? Noah? David? All solid, right? I mean, you keep going on, right? I mean, and they all have that thing in common, right? And all those men and women, we could think about one thing: they took action, right? They put their belief into action, and I think that's the strong point that he's talking about here. And again, I don't know if anybody can think of anything. Back up here just real quick before we ask that question, but when you think about in verse 21. Anybody that has a son, now there's been days I wanted to kill Miles, but not for this reason alone, but just I want to say, but anybody that has a child, right? I mean, what that means, right? I mean, that's heart-wrenching. I mean, that, all joking aside, that's just heart-wrenching to think about having to do that, right? And I mean, you read through that, and we've just, we've done that study that we've done in the Old Testament so far, but do you see any hesitation? You really don't. You really don't. And for his mindset, I think if you read that, and when you read that concept, he had done it, right? In Abraham's mind, he had sacrificed Isaac. He was fully committed to doing it. And why was that?
Well, he had faith, and he had trust in God that he knew it didn't matter what he did, right? He had trust that God would raise him from the dead if necessary, right?
Yeah.
That's the point, I think.
Exactly right. Exactly right. He had no doubt. Remember how much trouble he got into when he first found out he was going to have, God promised him a son? What did he, him and Sarah both laughed about it, right? I mean, he'd long past that now. I mean, he'd long past that, but the idea there, he was justified. And again, that idea of being justified, that he had carried forth and done what God had told him to do. And so the idea there, and that again, that word, I meant to mention this earlier, that word in verse 20, again, that idea of that word of being dead, again, it means hollow or defective or empty. And again, I mentioned that earlier, I had a note here, but that we talked about that with Donnie Rader as far as, do you believe God? And obviously, if you made that statement, not just believe in God, but you believe God, obviously, Abraham did. And so, again, he talks about there in verse 22, not that he gloried in his works or anything like that, but he talks about in verse 22, it says, and by works faith was made perfect. Now, when we talk about the word perfect there, what are we talking about? Somebody said it. Complete? The idea of being complete. In other words, that we've done what we should have done. And then in verse 23, I think it's again, just that we just read, it says, and the scripture was fulfilled, says, Abraham believed God, and it was accounted to him for righteousness, and he was called the friend of God. So why, in this context then, why was he a friend of God? What makes us a friend of God?
Well, I think we see a good time. So belief here encompasses more than just a mental assent, right? How did Abraham perform? He believed God, and it was credited to him as righteousness because he did what God told him to do. That's what belief means, right? As a whole. So
yeah. I mean, and we think about that in our lives now, right? I mean, just think about how much faith we put in other people sometimes. Maybe it's somebody we work with, or maybe it's a boss you have, or someone in you, and they tell you they're going to do something. We put a lot of confidence and faith in it. Yes.
we become a friend of God? We do what he says to do.
Yep.
Follow his commandments.
That's a great point. You, Benjamin?
How would you answer the person who gets worried with this chapter? Where they say, all right, this is the kind of faith that I need to have. Faith works. And they almost become fearful of, am I doing enough? And, through my works, being justified and things like that. What are your thoughts on how we can help Christians sometimes with that? With, I don't even know if I'm doing enough, or maybe I'm not. So people struggle with that sometimes.
Yeah. Wow. You have to ask a question with 10 minutes left in class. No. I knew I wasn't going to get by. No, go ahead. You say, go ahead. I'll come back to you. Go ahead. No, go ahead. Yeah, go ahead.
My answer to that one would be refer to the previous section that it talked about, where it talked about showing no partiality and showing mercy to all. When you start comparing yourself, whenever you start asking that question, am I doing enough to things, normally you ask, is it enough, when you start comparing yourself to other things. When you look at the people of Hebrews chapter 11, and these Hall of Famers that they say, you're comparing yourself to Abraham, right, who's mentioned in the Bible, will be remembered forever because of that. And it's daunting to think about it, but you also have to remember, Abraham made a ton of mistakes. David made a ton of mistakes. No one that has ever come to this planet, save for one, has ever been any different than anyone else. And their mistakes led to entire nations being at war and thousands of hundreds of people dying, right? And if I make a mistake, I disappoint people in my life, but a lot of people don't die, right? Yeah. There's a whole bunch of different things that come into play with that. What I would respond to that would be, look at the Bible, don't look at other people. Remember that the Lord is merciful, and you do the best job you can, and only you can answer that. Have confidence, right?
Very good.
Yeah, I think of the passages that we see where the body is compared to the members of the church, right? The physical body, we all have differing abilities, and it's a little bit of time. And what Sean said there is, we got to be careful what standard we're comparing ourselves against. We compare ourselves against what the scriptures say and do, and we have certain abilities and whatever we're able to do, and we do that according to the scriptures, right? What we know to do, what we should be doing, right? And so I guess you could, yeah, sometimes you wonder, am I doing enough, right? But that's probably a show of a tender heart, right? That's a comment I would make to somebody. Well, that's a good heart because you're thinking about, hey, am I doing enough, right? And so, again, it's hard to I guess you could have a conversation. Well, let's look at what you're doing, and you could help somebody through that discussion and see, give them your opinion. But
Steve?
It's really where your heart is and how the Lord sees you and how you're using your time and efforts in the kingdom.
Steve?
Certainly worrying about, that is taking time away from you being able to be effective. But I think about the parable of the talents too. The master he knew exactly what everyone's capability was, and he gave them the resources they needed to exhibit that. And so if I'm the 2-talent, man, I've been able to do what I can, I'm still going to achieve less than the 5-talent man did as far as product and work. But, my master knows me. He knows me personally. So that gives me a lot of comfort.
I think the parable of the talents is where I was going to head, or at least try to respond. Go ahead.
Someone who's personally dealt with this, so I'm sure a lot have. I'm not really, but something I think of that I'm learning more about, and I'm slowly getting better at. It's a mentality. It's a fear-based faith, really. You're fearful you haven't done enough, and I feel like there's a lack of understanding of what Christ did for you, and how much, everyone has sinned. To Sean's point, everyone has sinned. David sinned, Abraham sinned, and if I understand how much I need Christ every day, I had a situation recently where I lost my temper. member and I had to go ask for forgiveness from that person, and it just made me think, like, this is why I need Christ, because I mess up. Like, I have these moments where I just think, if I didn't have Christ, what would I do, right? And so this fear of, like, am I doing enough is really focused on how am I earning. You kind of are in that mindset of, I need to earn my salvation. I need to do enough to be on God's good graces, instead of, I do these things because Christ has saved me already. Like, I do these things out of motivation because I love God and He's done this for me.
Go ahead.
So, what is enough? Do you define enough? I mean, it's like you said, are you trying to earn your salvation? Is there an element of that in there? Or maybe we should be asking ourselves the question, am I living by faith? Am I doing what God asked me to do today? Those days, Abraham got up and herded sheep. But there was one day that God said, I want you to sacrifice your son.
Yeah.
And so he just did what God asked him to do,
Yeah.
when God asked him to do it. And so maybe we should just get up every day and try to live by faith.
Yeah, that's a great point. I think that's, and again, that's a whole another study, I guess. That's kind of when some of the stuff, and I knew I wasn't going to have time to get into it in here, but it's, where you get into the conflict, and, we haven't really talked about Calvinistic belief and all that, because, like I said, just trying to stick to what James says. But that's kind of where somebody will take in and say, well, they see Romans and what Paul says in Romans is conflicting with James, and again, that's that idea of understanding the works that Paul's speaking against and the works that he's talking about here being two different types of works. And again, that's a whole another animal. That's a whole nother one to go after. Go ahead.
I was just thinking of Romans chapter 4, when I know that this is a big subject, right? So be a little bit careful. But we got to remember, right? We haven't earned anything.
Yep.
Right? It's by the grace of God. So the one that works, earns something, as May mentioned there. But the one that worketh not doesn't do perfectly, which that's us, right? We don't perfectly keep anything. That's our salvation is earned by grace ultimately, but through faith, right, and through our obedience, right?
I'll just add something to that. For me, like, fixing that problem is trying to trust God more. That He's going to stick to what He promises. And He's promised that, somebody who sent their only son doesn't want to lose us. That mentality, like, sometimes we just think He just wants to get rid of us. And, like, somebody who gave their only son doesn't just want to get rid of us. And so, just like for me, just trusting that He knows what's best, and if I'm seeking that, then it gives me a whole lot more peace on that line for myself.
Yeah, I think, and somebody mentioned it at the beginning of class today. It's too many times that we want to judge, or we think about God like we think, or we think God is going to judge like we judge, which is not even close, right? And that's the kind of thing I think, and back to that point of being able to do the works and being justified by faith, or the works that justify our faith here are just those things that we're applying ourselves, and we're trying to do what we can, and just trying to get better, like you said, living by faith and trying to do what we can on a daily basis. So I know we didn't get quite done with the chapter. I will finish it up next week, but just like we've always kind of been ending the class. Oh, go ahead, Joanna.
Abraham and Rahab are giving you your examples. They are two people who couldn't be more of a contrast.
Yeah.
A rich man,
Yeah.
well-known, respected Hebrew,
Yep.
versus a low-class woman,
Yep.
Canaanite,
Yep.
who by her dress you knew immediately her profession,
Yep.
and in different parts of their spiritual walk of maturity.
Yep.
Both saved by faith through grace.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think, and I didn't have time to do it this morning, but if you want to read it before we go into it next week, but if you want to read Joshua chapter 2, verses 9 through 14, that's a statement that Rahab makes. And to me, it's one of the most powerful statements. It's like Ruth's statement to Naomi. It's one of those statements that just like, wow, there's people that wandered in the wilderness for 40 years. They saw all 10 plagues, and they didn't make the statement that woman made, right? Being, like you said, knowing the profession and knowing where she was from, and didn't have the background, but she said what she said. And it's powerful. And we'll read it to start class next week. But I do appreciate everybody. And any other comments anybody's got before we close up? All right. Well, thanks, everybody. Thank y'all very much.